There is a moment, and every soldier who has ever stood in a training yard knows this moment, when someone decides to test you. Not your strength, not your speed, your tolerance. They want to see how much you will swallow before you choke on it. They want to see if you will bend your head, go quiet, and let them have their little victory. They are counting on the fact that you are outnumbered, that the crowd is watching, that the embarrassment alone will be enough to make you small. They were counting on the wrong woman. Her name was Sergeant Major Priya Venkatesan. She had been in the Indian Army for 14 years when the incident happened. 14 years of waking before the sun, of running until her lungs felt like crumpled newspaper, of earning every single stripe on her uniform the hard way. She was not tall. She was not particularly imposing to look at. She had a face that strangers on the street might describe as calm, maybe even gentle, the kind of face that made people assume she was someone's school teacher or someone's quiet older sister. But the soldiers who had trained under her, the ones who had watched her move across a combat floor or break down a rifle blindfolded in under 40 seconds, they knew something the strangers on the street did not. Priya Venkatesan was not gentle. She was precise. And there's a difference between those two things that most people only learn when it is too late. The day it happened was a Thursday. The kind of Thursday that does not announce itself as significant. Gray sky, cold ground, the kind of morning that smells like wet concrete and boot polish. The training base was in full activity. Over 1,000 recruits were cycling through their morning drills across 3 different fields, which meant there was noise everywhere, the kind of layered noise that military training yards make, shouted counts and boots striking dirt, and the occasional bark of a senior officer correcting someone's form. It was, by every measure, an ordinary morning. Priya was walking from the administration block toward Field C, which was her assignment for the day. She had a clipboard under her arm. She was not in a hurry. She had learned long ago that hurrying on a base looks like uncertainty, and uncertainty invites challenge. And she had spent 14 years making sure that nobody on any base she served on ever mistook her for a woman who could be challenged. She passed the edge of Field B. That was where the new intake was drilling. The batch of male recruits who had arrived 3 weeks earlier, young men between 18 and 22, most of them still in the phase where the Army felt like a performance. The phase where they were still figuring out who they were going to be, which meant some of them were still figuring out what they could get away with. She heard the voice before she identified where it came from. I'd bend over. Laughter. A ripple of it. The kind that moves through a group of young men like a stone thrown in still water. She stopped walking. Not because she was startled. Not because she was unsure what she had heard. She stopped the way you stop when you have found the thing you were looking for, even though you were not looking for it. She turned. There were 11 of them clustered near the edge of the field, a loose group around one central figure. A recruit named Deepak Rao, 20 years old, broad across the shoulders, the kind of young man who had probably never been told no in a way that actually stuck. He was smiling in a way that young men smile when they have said something that got a reaction, which is a kind of smile that has very little joy in it and a great deal of need. Standing beside him were 10 others, some grinning, some watching with the specific stillness of people who wanted to see what was going to happen without being implicated in it. Priya looked at the group. She let the silence sit for a moment the way you let a kettle build. Not because you are uncertain, but because when it boils, you want everything to be ready. She walked toward them. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be discussed on that base for months afterward. Not loudly. Not the kind of discussion that gets written into reports or repeated in morning briefings. The quieter kind. The kind that happens in barack rooms late at night, or in a mess hall when a particular name comes up. The kind of discussion that shapes how a place understands itself and what it will and will not allow. But to understand those 30 seconds, you have to understand who Priya Venkatesan was before that Thursday morning. You have to go back much further than Field B. You have to go back to a small town in Tamil Nadu, to a girl who was told very clearly and very often exactly what she was allowed to want. Priya grew up in Karur, a mid-sized town known for its textile industry and its temples and its very specific ideas about what a girl's life was supposed to look like. She was the second of 3 children, with an older brother who was treated like a promise, and a younger sister who was treated like a flower, and Priya, in the middle, who was treated like a question no one had gotten around to answering yet. Her father worked in textile export, and her mother managed the house with the kind of quiet efficiency that Priya would later recognize as its own form of military discipline. Everything on time, everything in its place, every emotion rationed out carefully so the household could keep functioning. She was not an unhappy child. That is important. There's a version of this story where the difficulty of early life explains everything that follows, where every act of strength is traced back to some original wound. And that version is too simple and also mostly wrong. Priya was not running from anything. She was running towards something, and she had known what it was since she was 9 years old and watched a female NCC officer lead a parade through the center of town on Republic Day. She did not have words for it then. She just had the feeling, the specific physical feeling of watching someone occupy space in a way that demanded nothing from anyone. The officer walked like she had already been given permission, like she had given it to herself. Priya decided at 9 that she wanted to walk like that. Her parents were not opposed, exactly. They were what most parents in her community were: cautious. The army was for sons, or if not strictly for sons, then not quite for daughters either. There would be questions. There would be the marriage timeline. There was the fact that physical training at that level was considered, in certain circles, unwomanly, which is a word that does a lot of quiet damage in the lives of girls who have physical gifts and know it. Priya trained anyway. She got up before her parents were awake and ran the lane behind their street. She did push-ups in her room with the door closed. She read every article she could find about the Army and women in the Army and what it took to pass the selection. When she was 15, she joined the NCC. When she was 17, she applied for a competitive physical training scholarship program. When she was 20, she sat the Army entrance examination and scored in the top 4% nationally. Her mother cried when the results came. Her father was silent for a long time. The specific silence of a man recalculating something he had assumed was already settled. And then he nodded once, the way men of his generation nod when they have decided something cost them less than they expected. She left for training 6 weeks later. The first year was, in her own words, the best and worst year of her life in roughly equal measure, and sometimes at the exact same moment. The physical training was brutal in the way that good things are often brutal, not gratuitous but honest. It took what you had, and then asked for more, and then did not apologize for asking. Priya discovered during that first year that she was not just physically capable, but tactically intelligent, which is a different and rarer thing, the ability to see a situation whole and find its lever point, the spot where the least force produces the most result. She was also, during that first year, the target of the kind of low-grade, persistent testing that women in male-dominated institutions learn to map the way they map a building's exits. It was rarely overt. It was comments delivered just below the level of formal reprimand. It was tasks assigned in ways designed to create failure. It was the specific grinding work of being made to feel that your presence was provisional, that you were tolerated rather than welcomed, that you could be uninvited at any moment if you stopped performing at a level that left no room for argument. Priya performed at that level. She did not complain. She did not, in those early years, confront. She filed things away. She got better at everything. She understood, with the tactical intelligence that was already becoming her defining quality, that the most effective thing she could do with every obstacle placed in front of her was to clear it so cleanly that the person who placed it had to watch her go. By her 3rd year, she had been promoted ahead of her batch. By her 5th year, she was training other soldiers. By her 8th year, she had a reputation that moved through the service ahead of her. Not a flashy reputation, not the kind built on a single dramatic moment, but the steady, accumulated kind that forms when people in different postings compare notes and keep arriving at the same word for someone. Formidable. She was posted to the training base in Pune at the start of her 14th year. It was a large base, one of the primary intake facilities for new male recruits, which meant it ran a constant cycle of fresh batches coming in uncertain and going out shaped. Priya was one of 4 female senior instructors on the base, which sounds like a reasonable number until you consider that the base ran 4,000 personnel, at which point it becomes a different kind of number entirely. The culture on the base was not hostile, exactly. It was something more ambient than that, a background hum of assumption. The assumption that the male instructors were the real instructors, that the female ones were supplementary, that authority had a default gender, and everything else was a variation. Most of the recruits arrived with this assumption already installed, picked up in the homes and schools and social environments they came from, and they wore it lightly, the way you were something you have never had a reason to take off. Most of the time, it expressed itself in small ways. A recruit who listened slightly less. A question directed to a male colleague when Priya had just given the answer. The microtransactions of institutional gender bias that are individually dismissible and collectively exhausting. Every woman who has ever been the only one in a room, or one of very few, knows the precise weight of that exhaustion. It does not make you dramatic. It does not make you angry, not in a hot way. It makes you very, very good at reading the room, because the room is always one small shift away from becoming something you have to manage. Priya managed it. She filed things. She kept getting better. She got up before the sun, and she ran, and she trained, and she did the work that nobody could argue with, and she carried the quieter work at the same time, the invisible second job of existing in a space that had not quite decided whether to let her own it. And then, one Thursday morning, a 20-year-old recruit named Deepak Rao made his calculation. He chose a moment when she was walking alone, when the group was watching, when the call and response of peer performance was already in the air. He chose a moment designed to make refusal look like weakness and silence look like acceptance. He had done the math that young men of his type always do, the math that adds up height and gender and the presence of an audience and concludes that the outcome is fixed before it starts. He said it, loud enough to carry, loud enough for the laughter to follow. And Priya Venkatesan stopped walking. She turned, and she walked toward him with the specific, unhurried certainty of someone who has been waiting, not for this moment exactly, but for the moment that this moment always eventually becomes, the moment when calculation meets consequence, and consequence arrives without warning, without drama, without anything except the clean, efficient weight of 14 years of being exactly this good at exactly this thing. She was 17 meters away when she stopped walking. Deepak was still smiling. The smile was doing less work than it had been a moment ago. The math was producing a different answer than expected, and he had not caught up to it yet. She looked at him, not at the group, not at the audience, at him, the way you look at a lever point. Come here, she said. Quiet. Exact. He did not move, which was, she would reflect later, his last free decision of the morning. She closed the remaining distance in 4 steps. What followed was not a fight. A fight has uncertainty in it. What happened on Field B that morning had no uncertainty in it at all. It had, instead, the quality of a demonstration, clear, clean, educational, the kind of thing that is over before most of the audience has processed that it started. Deepak Rao had a background in wrestling. He had come to the Army with a state-level youth tournament medal and the muscle memory of someone who had spent 3 years throwing opponents to the ground. He was faster than he looked and stronger than his age suggested, and he had spent 3 weeks on the base developing the specific confidence of a recruit who believes he understands his environment. He reached for her, the grab, the setup, the move that started every match he had ever won. She was not there when his hand arrived. She was already at a different angle, already past his center of gravity, already using the momentum of his own reach against him in the specific, merciless way that someone who has trained in combat judo for 11 years uses a larger opponent's strength as the instrument of their own defeat. The first arm went in 7 seconds. The second arm went 4 seconds after that. Not broken. The accounts that circulated later would say broken, and the word is dramatic enough that it stuck, but the clinical reality was bilateral elbow hyperextension, which is a way of saying she took both joints to the absolute limit of their range and held them there long enough to make the point without making the injury permanent. He was on the ground. He was in significant pain. He was not, by any technical measure, able to get up and continue. The whole sequence took 11 seconds. Around them, over 1,000 recruits had gone entirely silent. Priya stood up. She retrieved her clipboard from where she had set it on the ground. She looked at the group of 11, not at Deepak, who was on the ground making sounds that had very little language in them, but at the 10 others, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had watched. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She picked up her clipboard, turned toward Field C, and walked away with the same unhurried, ground-covering stride she had been walking with before any of this started, the stride of someone who has given themselves permission and no longer needs it from anyone else. The silence on that field lasted a full 40 seconds after she left. Then someone said something very quietly, and someone else responded, and the bass began to make noise again, the way a river resumes after you have thrown a stone in it. everything continuing but the water remembering exactly where the stone went in. Deepak Rao was taken to the medical unit. He was put on a 7-day limited duty assignment. He filed no formal complaint, which was a decision that represented either wisdom or the specific embarrassment of a young man who had made a very public calculation and been very publicly wrong. The base command reviewed the incident. The review took 2 days and concluded with a formal commendation for Priya, the language of which was careful and measured and official, and said between every line that she had done exactly what the situation required. But the story was already moving through the base faster than any official document could follow it. It moved the way true things move in closed communities, not as gossip, not as rumor, but as information, as the kind of knowledge that changes how a place understands its own edges. Because what happened on Field B that Thursday morning was not about one recruit. It was about the math, the specific calculation that gets made when someone sees a woman alone and decides to test her, and what happens to that math when the answer comes back wrong. When the answer comes back so precisely, so quickly, so completely wrong that everyone who watched it knows they will never make the same calculation again. Not on this base, not with this woman, not in this lifetime. Over 1,000 soldiers watched it happen or heard about it from someone who did, which on a military base is close enough to the same thing. Over 1,000 soldiers updated their understanding. And somewhere across the base in 4 different Barak buildings and 2 mess halls and 1 small room in the administration block where Priya Venkatesan sat at her desk and opened a file and kept working, the question of what a woman in this institution was allowed to be was quietly, irreversibly answered. She had answered it herself. She had answered it in 11 seconds. And she had walked away without looking back. The story spread the way fire spreads in dry grass. Low, fast, and impossible to stop once it has found the right conditions. By Friday morning, every recruit on the base knew what had happened on Field B. By Saturday, the instructors in the neighboring unit had heard 3 different versions, each one slightly more detailed than the last, each one accurate in all the ways that mattered. By the following Tuesday, the story had reached a sister base 40 kilometers away, carried by a supply convoy driver who had heard it from a cook who had been standing near the mess hall window when someone who had been there was explaining it to someone who had not. In most of its versions, the story was accurate. The location was right. The number of witnesses was right. The 11 seconds were right. What varied between versions was the motivation assigned to Priya, whether she had been calm or cold, whether she had said something before or only after, whether the look on her face had been anger or something that was harder to name. These variations said less about what had happened and more about what people needed the story to mean. Some needed it to be a story about rage, because rage is legible and expected. Some needed it to be a story about calculation, because calculation is what they would have chosen. A few, the ones who had watched her walk away, described her face as completely neutral, which was the most unsettling version, and also, those who knew her confirmed, the most accurate. Priya was aware the story was moving. She was not unaware of anything that moved through any base she served on. This was, by her 14th year, simply how she operated, with the continuous low-level situational awareness of someone who had learned early that environments change, and that the changes matter. She tracked the story the way a navigator tracks weather. Not anxiously, not with any particular plan to intervene. She tracked it because information is always useful, and because she wanted to know what shape the story was taking as it traveled, what it was becoming in other people's mouths. What it was becoming, she noted, was larger than she had intended. Not in the dramatic sense. She had not intended drama. She had intended precision, a calibrated response to a calibrated provocation, nothing more and nothing less than the situation required. But stories do not stay calibrated. They expand to fill the shape of what people are hungry to hear, and what the people on this base were apparently hungry to hear was something that the 11 seconds on Field B had provided without being designed to provide it. They were hungry for evidence that the equation was different from what they had assumed. That the default math, the math that assigned authority by gender, that treated women in uniform as a variation on the standard rather than a standard in themselves, was not, in fact, fixed. That it could be revised. That had just been revised. Publicly. In 11 seconds. In front of more than 1,000 witnesses. This was the story they were telling. This was what the 11 seconds had become in transit. Priya sat with this information for several days. She did not discuss it. She did not seek it out. She went to work. She ran her sessions on Field C. She completed her administrative obligations. She ate in the mess hall and slept in the officer's quarter block and woke before the sun and ran the perimeter and came back and did it again. The routine of it was not armor. She did not need armor. It was simply how she lived, with the discipline that had carried her through 14 years of an institution that had made her earn every centimeter of the ground she stood on. What occupied her in the spaces between the routine was something slightly different from what most people assumed occupied her. She was not thinking about Deepak Rao. She had, in the precise and somewhat clinical way that she processed events that had been handled, finished thinking about Deepak Rao almost immediately after the incident closed. He was a variable that had expressed itself and been addressed. He was on limited duty. The base command had reviewed the incident and found in her favor. He would either learn or he would not. And she had done what she could to create the conditions for learning, and that was the extent of her responsibility to his education. What occupied her was the 10 who had left. She had looked at them after. She had made eye contact with each of them in the silence that followed. Not hostile eye contact, not a warning, simply acknowledgement. She had looked at each face long enough to read it. And what she had read was not what she expected. She had expected the usual: defiance in one or two, guilt in a couple, blankness in the rest. What she saw, instead, was something more complicated. In most of the 10 faces, there was something she could only describe as recalibration happening in real time. Not shame. Shame requires a previous moral position that has been violated, and most of these young men had not held a moral position on this. They had held a default, which is different. A default does not produce shame when it is challenged. It produces something more like vertigo, the brief, disorienting sensation of standing on ground you assumed was solid and finding it is not. That vertigo, Priya knew, was the moment. That was the teachable instant, the narrow window that opens between an old assumption and the new information that has displaced it. What happened in that window mattered enormously. Leave it alone, and it closes, and people walk back to their defaults because defaults are comfortable. Enter it wrong. With anger, with score settling, with the kind of demonstration that is about power rather than principle, and it closes harder, and people retreat into defensiveness that is worse than the default was. She had known, in the seconds after she walked away, that she needed to enter that window correctly. What she decided to do was not what anyone expected. She requested a session, formally, through the base training coordinator. A 1-hour session with a new intake batch. All 43 of them, not just the 11 who had been on Field B, on the topic of hand-to-hand combat methodology and physical leverage. A normal training session, on the face of it, the kind of thing instructors requested regularly. The training coordinator approved it without asking questions. It was scheduled for the following Wednesday. 2 in the afternoon, Field B. The same field. She picked the same field deliberately. Wednesday arrived with better weather than Thursday had, clear sky, dry ground, the kind of afternoon that is functional rather than beautiful, which was appropriate. Priya arrived at Field B at 1:50. The 43 recruits were already assembled, which told her 2 things: that they had heard about the venue and understood its significance, and that not one of them had thought about not showing up, which told her something about the current state of their calculation. They stood in their standard formation, 43 young men between 18 and 22, their faces arranged in various configurations of careful. Deepak Rao was not among them. He was still on limited duty. The 10 who had been there Thursday were scattered through the formation, identifiable to Priya by the very slight difference in how they held themselves compared to the others. The ones who had not witnessed it and were running on secondhand information had the forward lean of people who want to see something. The 10 who had been there had a different posture entirely, the kind of posture that comes from already knowing how something ends. Priya stood in front of them for a moment. She let the formation settle into itself. A cloud passed. Someone's boot shifted on the ground. She said, "I am not here to teach you to fight." She let that sit. You will learn to fight in the regular combat rotation. That is not this session. This session is about something more fundamental than fighting, and if you understand it correctly, you will be significantly better soldiers and also significantly harder to kill. Those 2 things are related. She had their attention in the complete way. Not the performed attention of recruits who are watching an authority figure, but the real kind, the kind where people are genuinely uncertain what comes next. The thing I am here to teach you, she said, is leverage. Physical leverage, specifically, but also the other kind. She set her clipboard on the ground. This was a signal her regular students had learned to read. When the clipboard goes down, something real is about to happen. Physical leverage is the application of mechanical advantage through the human body. A 100-kilogram man can be moved by a 60-kilogram woman if she understands where his mass is and where his balance lives and how to shift one against the other. This is not theory. This is physics. It works every single time, without exception, on every human body ever assembled. She paused. The reason most people do not know this is that most people have spent their lives making size calculations. They see a bigger person and they compute, I'm smaller, therefore I am at a disadvantage. This computation is wrong. It is not just wrong in the way that bad math is wrong. It is wrong in a way that actively kills you. It builds the wrong map of the world, and soldiers with wrong maps die. She looked across the formation, row by row, face by face, in the direct way that she always looked at things she was addressing. Last Thursday, she said, one of your batch made a calculation. He computed something about size, about gender, about the math of who is allowed to dominate a situation. He got a very clear answer to that calculation. Not a smile, not emphasis, level. What I want you to understand is that the calculation was always wrong. Not just for him, for anyone who runs the same equation. The variables you think are fixed, size, gender, who is supposed to be in charge, who is supposed to defer, are not fixed. They are assumptions. Assumptions that dissolve the moment someone with better physics and better technique is standing in front of them. She bent down and picked up a weighted resistance band from the bag she had brought. Standard training equipment, nothing unusual. Today we're going to work the real physics. I'm going to teach you where the body's balance lies. I'm going to teach you how leverage works against mass. By the end of this session, the smallest person in this formation will understand exactly how to move a person twice their size. She looked at the formation again, and then she said, you will understand why the calculation you have been running your whole lives is wrong. Not because I told you it was wrong, because your body will know it is wrong. She began. The session ran for 1 hour and 23 minutes, which was 23 minutes past the scheduled end, and nobody left. Nobody shifted toward leaving. The 43 recruits worked through 8 consecutive leverage exercises: elbow mechanics, shoulder rotations, base disruption, center of gravity shifts, with a specific focused energy of people who have been given a framework that is reorganizing the way they understand something fundamental. Priya corrected form with the precise, impersonal efficiency of someone who cares about the physics more than the performance. She paired larger recruits with smaller ones deliberately. She made the physics visible in real bodies in real time, and she did it without commentary, without drama, without ever once referring again to Thursday. She did not need to refer to Thursday. Thursday was in the room. Thursday was in every pairing she constructed, in every moment when a smaller recruit moved a larger one correctly and understood, in the physical way you only understand things your body has done, that the map was different from what they had been given. At 3:13, she said, that is the session. She picked up her clipboard. She looked at the formation. One more thing, she said, not about physics. She waited. You will serve alongside women in this army. You will serve alongside men smaller than you and men larger than you. You will serve alongside people from every background and region and caste and family situation this country contains. And your life, at some point, will depend on the person next to you. She let the quiet settle the way she always let things settle. The question you should be asking, the only question that actually matters, is not who is supposed to be in charge based on how they look. The question is, who has the better map? Who has trained harder? Who knows the physics? She looked at the 10. She did not single them out. She included them. That person is the one you listen to. That person is the one you follow. That is not a new rule. That is the oldest rule in any fighting force that ever survived long enough to be worth naming. She turned. She walked off the field. The formation stood in place for several seconds after she left. Not the frozen silence of last Thursday, but something different. A thinking silence. the kind that follows something that has been absorbed rather than something that has merely been witnessed. One of the recruits, a young man named Harpreet Singh, 18 years old, from a village in Punjab, who had come to the army because it was the only door his family's circumstances had left open, turned to the man beside him and said very quietly, "She's something else, Yar." It was not a poetic statement. It was not intended as tribute. It was the specific, inadequate language that people reach for when they have just encountered something they do not have the vocabulary for yet. The man beside him nodded. They were both right. The base commander, Brigadier Ashok Malhotra, had been watching from the edge of the field for the last 40 minutes of the session. He had not announced his presence. He had not needed to. Priya had known he was there. She had noted his arrival at the periphery in the way she noted everything at the periphery, without changing anything about what she was doing, without acknowledging him until the session was completely over and the formation had been dismissed. Then, she walked in his direction. He was a man of 56, lean and gray at the temples, with 32 years of service behind him and the particular quality that long service in command develops, the ability to read a situation without performing the reading. He watched her approach. "You did not have to do that," he said. "Not critically. Observationally." "No," she agreed. "I did not. It was your call." "It was my field," she said. "They're my batch." The session was appropriate. He was quiet for a moment. In the distance, the formation was breaking up, recruits moving toward their next obligation. "The session was more than appropriate," he said. She accepted this without responding to it. "The commendation stands," he said. "I want you to know that. What happened Thursday was within your authority and your right. I reviewed it thoroughly." "I know," she said. "I'm also putting you forward for the advanced instructor nomination." She looked at him. This was, she registered, the look that the base command had been considering since before Thursday. The advanced instructor position was not created by the incident. The incident had, perhaps, moved the timeline. "I accept," she said. He nodded. He began to walk toward the administration block. "Venkatesan," he said, without turning back. She waited. "Your session, just now? The physics lecture?" "Yes." "You know, it was not just a physics lecture." "I know." He walked on. She stood on Field B for a moment after he left. The field was empty now. All 43 recruits dispersed, Brigadier Malhotra receding toward the block, the afternoon light sitting flat and clear across the ground. She looked at the spot perhaps 15 meters away, where Deepak Rao had been standing Thursday morning. The ground looked exactly like the rest of the ground. It did not look like a lesson. It did not look like anything except dry dirt and training yard. It was both those things and something else as well. She bent down and picked up a resistance band that a recruit had left behind. She added it to her bag. She straightened up. She walked toward Field C, clipboard under her arm, moving the way she always moved, the same ground-covering stride, the same unhurried certainty, and the field behind her was already beginning to be in the past, which was where she put things once they were finished, in the specific and necessary past where things that had been handled go, and where she did not visit them again. The nomination went in on a Friday. By the following Monday, the base was aware of it, which is how bases work. Information that moves through official channels still finds unofficial ones, still arrives at mess hall tables and barack rooms and the edge-of-field conversations that constitute a military community's actual nervous system. The advanced instructor nomination meant a different thing depending on who was hearing about it. For the senior officers, it was a competency decision, which it was. Priya's 14-year record was unambiguous, and the nomination would have been made with or without the Thursday incident. The incident had, as Brigadier Malhotra had implied to her on the field, moved the timeline, not the conclusion. For the female staff on the base, the 3 other women in senior instructor positions, the administrative officers, the handful of female medical unit staff, the nomination was something larger. Not because any of them said so, not in any formal or declared way, but because they went slightly quieter in the specific way that people go quiet when something happens that they have been waiting to see happen, without quite saying they were waiting. Lieutenant Nandini Kaur, one of the 3, stopped by Priya's office the Tuesday after the nomination was announced. She was a compact woman of 38 with 12 years of service and the dry, considered manner of someone who had made their peace with what the institution offered and what it withheld. She stood in the doorway. She did not come in. "Heard the news," she said. "Yes," Priya said. "It is well-deserved," Nandini said. "You know that." "I know." Nandini was quiet for a moment. She was looking at something on the wall behind Priya's desk. A base map, standard issue, nothing particular about it. "Last Thursday," she said. "Before Field B." Priya waited. "Were you afraid?" It was a question asked carefully, with the particular care that women in their profession sometimes apply to questions that could be read as weakness and are not weakness at all. Priya considered it. She was not in the habit of performing certainty when she was actually working through something real. "No," she said. "Not afraid. Tired." Nandini looked at her. "The same kind of tired?" Nandini asked. "Yes," Priya said. "The same kind." Nandini nodded once, the kind of nod that contains a full paragraph but has decided that the paragraph is not necessary. She left. The same kind of tired is a phrase that does not mean one thing. It means an accumulation. It means 14 years of the specific exhaustion of being excellent in a space that has not fully decided to receive your excellence. It means waking up every morning and being precisely as competent as you are, and then spending a portion of every day managing the ambient doubt of people who have not yet updated their assumptions about you. It means the double effort that nobody acknowledges, the effort of the work itself, which is substantial, and the effort of doing the work while also carrying the secondary project of being visible and legible and impossible to dismiss in an environment that would sometimes prefer if you were smaller. It is not a dramatic exhaustion. It is not the kind that produces breakdowns or scenes or declarations. It is the kind that simply accumulates compound interest on a debt that was never yours to carry, and it sits in you the way long-carried weight sits, not painfully after a while, just permanently, just as part of the landscape of yourself. Priya had carried it for 14 years. She would carry it for more. She was not naive about this. The nomination was progress, real progress, not symbolic, but progress in an institution moves the way glaciers move, which is to say, genuinely, consequentially, and on a timeline that requires you to be patient in a way that is sometimes indistinguishable from resignation if you do not hold the distinction clearly in your mind. She held it clearly. What Thursday had done, what she had done on Thursday, through 11 seconds and then through a 1 hour and 23-minute physics session, was move something that needed to be moved. Not the whole glacier. A piece of it. A visible piece, in front of enough witnesses that the movement was on record in the way that things are on record when over 1,000 people have seen them. This was, she reflected, probably the most you could do in a single Thursday morning. The base continued. The days ran forward in the particular rhythm of a training facility. Intake cycles completing, new batches arriving, the continuous loop of young civilians becoming something more specific. Priya ran her sessions, filed her reports, contributed to the rotation of reviews and assessments and curriculum updates that constituted the administrative backbone of the training program. She moved through the base with the same quality of presence she had always moved through it, with nothing announced and nothing withheld. Deepak Rao returned from limited duty on the 8th day. He reported to his regular rotation without incident. The incident was not referenced formally. He trained. He was not, as far as Priya could observe, permanently damaged by what had happened. Not in his body, which recovered fully, and not in his spirit, which she watched from the distance of professional observation for signs of the kind of resentment that festers and creates future problems. What she observed was more complex than resentment. He trained harder. His form improved. He worked without the edge of performance that had characterized his early weeks, the need to be seen being impressive, and replaced it with something quieter and more useful, genuine effort stripped of audience. She was not going to assign meaning to this that it might not have. She was not going to construct a redemption arc out of improved push-up form. But she noted it. She was, at the core of her professional practice, someone who noted things. 3 weeks after the incident, a journalist contacted the base. Her name was Devika Sharma. She was a staff writer at a national newspaper with a particular focus on women in the Indian military, a beat she had been covering for 6 years with the quality of focus that comes from caring about something beyond the deadline. She had heard about the incident. The story had, by this point, moved beyond the base community entirely, carried outward by veterans' online forums, and a couple of social media posts from people who had second or third-hand accounts, and she was requesting a formal interview with Sergeant Major Venkatesan. The request went through the base public affairs officer, which meant it went through Brigadier Malhotra's office, which meant Priya was informed and asked whether she wished to participate. The decision was hers, with the standard caveat that the base would appreciate sensitivity about operational security matters, which she could be trusted to manage without needing to be told. She thought about it for 2 days. She was not someone who sought the spotlight. This was not false modesty. It was practical preference. The work was the work. The work did not require coverage to be real. She had been doing the work for 14 years without anyone outside the service writing about it, and the work had been real every single day of those 14 years. A journalist writing about it did not make it more real. But something else was also true, and she held it alongside the practical preference and considered them both. The story was already out there. It was already moving through spaces she did not control, in versions she had not authored. Some of those versions were accurate. Some had acquired the distortions of retelling. She had been described, in one account she was told about, as having broken both arms clean through at the elbow, which was medically dramatic and also entirely false. In another account, she had shouted something before the 11 seconds, a specific defiant statement that she had not, in fact, said and would not, in fact, have said because shouting before you act is not efficiency. It is theater. She did not want to be theater. She did not want her name attached to a version of her story that was bigger and louder and more dramatic than what had actually happened, because what had actually happened was already sufficient and did not need embellishment to carry weight. The only way to control the version was to offer the real one. She called the public affairs officer and said she would do the interview. Devika Sharma arrived on a Tuesday, cleared through the main gate with a visitor's pass and an escort, and was shown to a small meeting room near the administrative block. She was 41, smaller than Priya had expected from the byline photograph, with a focused, quietly assessing manner of someone who has spent years asking people to tell her things they would normally keep private. She had a recorder on the table and a notebook beside it, and she did not treat the recorder as something that needed to be mentioned or apologized for. Priya respected this. They sat across from each other. The table between them was standard government furniture, which is to say functional and beige, and the room smelled of old air conditioning and the particular institutional smell of rooms where decisions are regularly made. Devika said, "I appreciate you agreeing to this. I want to be upfront. I am interested in the incident, but I am more interested in the context. The incident without the context is just a story about one morning." "Yes," Priya said. "I want to talk about the 14 years. "That is the right conversation," Priya said. They talked for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Priya was precise and measured and gave the journalist what she came for. The real version, the one without embellishment, the one where 11 seconds of field action is preceded by 14 years of daily work and is followed by a 1 hour and 23-minute physics session and a nomination and a base that continues operating in its regular rhythms. The unglamorous version. The version where the significance is not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated weight of doing the work correctly every day in a space that has not always made it easy to do so. Devika asked at one point the question that she had clearly been building toward for the last 30 minutes of the interview. "What do you want people to take from this?" Priya was quiet for a moment. "I want people to understand what the work is," she said. "Not just the 11 seconds, the years, the sessions, the getting up before the sun every single day and doing it again. The not leaving when it is difficult to stay. The not becoming small because the space sometimes asks you to be small." She paused. "The 11 seconds happened because of 14 years, she said, not the other way around. And the 14 years were not building to a moment. They were the point. They're always the point. The moment is just when the years became visible to the people who were not paying attention to them before." Devika wrote something in her notebook. "Is there anything you would like to say directly to the young women who will read this?" she asked. Priya thought about this with the same directness she brought to everything. "Do the work," she said. "Not for an audience. Not for a moment. Not for the day when it is finally recognized. Do it because you are good at it and because it matters and because the alternative is not neutral. The alternative is smaller. And smaller is the only thing you should never consent to being." The recorder sat between them. The room was quiet. Devika clicked it off. She looked at Priya across the beige table. "I'm going to write this correctly," she said. "I know," Priya said. "That is why I am here." The article ran on a Saturday, 6 weeks after the incident. It led with a sentence that was not about the 11 seconds. It began instead with a training yard at 5:40 in the morning, with a woman running the base perimeter alone before the sun was fully up, with the kind of detail that places you in a body and a routine before it tells you anything about drama. It was read widely, not viral widely, not in the way that stories about women in combat sometimes go, the breathless, superlative way that treats a capable woman as a category violation rather than a person. It was read in the steadier, more durable way of something that arrives in front of the people it is meant for and stays with them. Priya received a significant amount of correspondence in the days after. Letters forwarded through the base. Messages through the base public affairs channel. 3 different women from 3 different postings who were in the Army or had applied to be, who wrote to say that the article had changed something in the geography of what they believed was possible for them. She read each one. She did not respond to most of them, not out of dismissiveness, but because she did not know what to say that would not reduce to platitude, and platitude was, in her estimation, an insult to the people who had taken the trouble to write honestly. One she responded to. It was from a 19-year-old from Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu, not far from Karur, where Priya had grown up, who had been waiting on a medical clearance for Army selection, and who wrote, not asking for inspiration, but asking a practical question: how do you train for the physical requirements when you are living somewhere without a proper gym? Priya wrote back a 2-page response. Specific, practical, detailed, the kind of response you give when someone has asked you a real question and you have a real answer. She put the other letters in a folder. She put the folder in a drawer. She went to bed at 10:30. She got up before the sun. She ran the perimeter. She had a session on Field C at 7. She was the same person she had been the day before the article and the day before the incident and every single one of the 14 years that preceded both. That was the thing that most accounts of what happened on Field B would get slightly wrong. The framing that suggests the person who walked off that field was different from the person who had walked onto it. As if the moment had made her. As if the 11 seconds were the event. She had been that person for 14 years. The 11 seconds were just when everyone else caught up.